Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group. Please note, the views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker. The Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. In this talk, Jim Hastie tells us the story of tank number D51, Deborah. He explains why she was a female tank, her role in the Battle of Cambrai, and the fascinating story of her recovery and current preservation.
Deborah is a very favourite lady of mine, and this is her story and Battle of the Tanks. Chapter 1, the prologue. Deborah was a female tank. She was part of D Battalion in the Royal Tank Corps. The second Deborah rose from the grave. 150 tanks were built, divided between male and female, with 75 of each type. Male tanks had sponsons, each one mounting a 57mm 6-pounder gun. Female tanks, on the other hand, each mounted 2 cumbersome sponsons designed to carry 2 Vickers water-cooled heavy machine guns instead, with tiny escape doors. Why Deborah? It was customary to name the tanks prior to their first appearance in battle. Names were prefixed with the initials HMLS, His Majesty's Landship. Contemporary sources suggest the names of wives and girlfriends were common. The name Deborah was given to less than 100 baby girls in 1900. Likely inspired by the Bible, the eponymous Deborah was a warrior prophetess who led the Israelites to victory over the Canaanites with 90 iron chariots. Today, the second Deborah is preserved for posterity in France. This is her story. Chapter 2, Deborah, the Genesis. Deborah D51 took part in her first action at Ypres salient during August 1917. She supported the drive by British forces to drive back the Germans from their front line that stretched from Buzinga to north of Zillebeke. On the first day, some 133 tanks went into action, but the vast majority got stuck in the soft terrain or were hit by shells. Deborah was based at Oosthoek Woods, which is north of Ypres. Oosthoek Wood was held for tank battalions C, F, G and D, D being Deborah's battalion. Only 33, including Deborah, made it back to their rallying points at Oosthoek Wood. 25%, huge losses. 222 soldiers were wounded, 9 were recorded as missing, 44 lost their lives. The Tank Corps commanders considered the casualties as insignificant compared to the damage done by tanks and the lives saved amongst the infantry. This is an extract from the vivid recollections of 2nd Lieutenant Horace Burks. Burks was only dimly aware of the other tanks advancing around him, but among them he could see D51 Deborah. It was not uncommon for tanks to be named the same, hence there were 2 Deborahs. The story of Deborah 1, August 1917. The first Deborah D51 was badly damaged in the bogs of Passchendaele. Later on in that month, she was subsequently damaged by shell fire at Bellevue on 21st of August. Bellevue was the lying up area not far from the woods where all the tanks gathered before action. On the 10th of September, she was recovered and repaired before returning to action. Regretfully, there are no records to confirm whether she made it to the end of the Great War. Frank Heap was allocated a new Mark IV female tank, manufacturer number 2620, crew number D51, and the name Deborah. His crew comprised first driver Lance Corporal G.C. Foote, gunner William Galway, gunner Joseph Cheverton, gunner F.W. Tipping, private W.G. Robinson, Lance Corporal David Marsden, and an unknown soldier. There will be more on Lance Corporal Foote later. Frank Heap's own position when he took over D51 was a second lieutenant. 4 of the crew were buried side by side at the British Cemetery at Flescars Hill, namely Cheverton, Galway, Tipping and Robertson. Frank Heap was awarded the Military Cross for his gallantry in battle. Where is driver Lance Corporal G.C. Foote? Gunner Joseph Cheverton killed on the day he turned 20. Gunner Fred Tipping was the father to 3 young children, and Gunner William Galway had survived the first day of the Somme. The letter from Frank Heap followed the next day, and he made no attempt to disguise his pain. Dear Mr. Foote, it is with the deepest sympathy that I write to tell you of the death in action of your son, George. He was in my tank in action on the 20th of this month when it was struck by a shell. He was killed instantly and painlessly, I am glad to say. We buried him 2 days later where he had fallen. It may be some consolation that we had avenged him in advance. We all feel his loss very deeply. His cheery spirits and unfailing good nature had endeared him to all. Of his courage, it would be impertinent on my part to speak, but his DCM, that is his Distinguished Conduct Medal, attested that, as a young officer in charge of a tank for the first time, I was helped to do my job by his tactful experience, and he had been spared, he would have made a splendid officer. We have had sad losses in the company, but none will be missed like George. The whole company regrets him bitterly. It strengthens one's religious beliefs to suffer a loss like this. It is impossible that a soul like George's should not go on living. I feel convinced I shall meet him again. I am having a bitter evening now, as 4 more of my crew have also gone, all finer fellows than I shall ever be. Please excuse these halting words, which utterly fail to express my sorrow and sympathy. I envy you the honour of having given such a son to your country. May God help and comfort you in this hour of need. Yours in deepest sorrow, Frank G. Heap. Now, I cannot imagine writing a letter like that. It's just incredible. Tanks were not very reliable. Deborah, who was knocked out by shell fire. It's only fair that we have a view from the German perspective. Lieutenant Ossenbrook had promised his men that the artillery would destroy Deborah as she emerged from the village. One of the infantrymen who stood guard over the battery was Erstaff Reversus Shaver of 27th Reserve Infantry Regiment. We then had to pull back behind Flescars to an artillery position under the command of Sergeant Lieutenant Reinst. We dragged the guns out of their pits. They had hit and put out of action a tank that emerged at the left. Although Frank Heap and 2 of his crew had survived Deborah's final journey, the danger was far from over, and they now had to somehow slip back to their own lines, avoiding capture or worse at the hands of the Germans who were still occupying the village. Second Lieutenant James Mackintosh must have heard what had happened directly from Frank Heap, his brother officer in No. 12 Company. On the right of Flescars, one tank had succeeded in penetrating to the farther edge of the village. Here it was blasted. 4 of the crew were killed outright, and the survivors crept back through the empty streets. Soon after this, their worst fears were realised, as recounted by Second Lieutenant Mackintosh. Round the next corner, he met a party of the enemy, face to face, and for a moment neither could decide whether to surrender or to claim surrender. But in the nick of time, a Jock scout appeared with bombs, and the Boche fled. Decades later, Frank Heap's grandson, Will Heap, came across an old service revolver inside a trunk at the family home. It was massively heavy, a fearsome thing. I told my father about it and he said, "That probably saved your grandfather's life." The story was that Frank had gone round a corner and there were lots of Germans there and he thought, "They're going to kill me." So he pointed his revolver at them and they all stuck their hands up and he ordered them in German to stay there and he carried on. Captain Edward Glanville Smith was impressed by Frank's achievement. He himself and the two other survivors somehow succeeded in fighting their way back to our lines. Heap, as I said already, was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry, and the citation summarised what happened after Deborah was destroyed. Although then, behind the German lines, he collected the remainder of his crew and conducted them in good order back to our own lines, in spite of heavy machine gun and snipers' fire. It was an epic escape, but it could not disguise the fact that not a single tank had managed to get past the German artillery. And although Deborah had come closest to reaching the objective, Flesqueurs still remained firmly in the hands of the enemy. Chapter 4, The Discovery. A young Cambrai schoolboy, Philippe Gorzinski, had a lifelong passion about World War I tanks, and this set off his desire to find relics in and around Cambrai, the scene of the first major tank battle in November 1917. 1977. He was introduced to a local shopkeeper, Michael Bacquet, known locally as Iron Man, who greatly assisted Philippe's investigations. Iron Man contacted British service organisations and French civic authorities, and a 60th anniversary reunion took place in 1977. More than 60 men took part in the reunion in Cambrai with an average age of 82. 1992. Their investigation took them to the village of Ribicourt, where they met with Martha Ballou, now in her 90s. Yes, my family was running a cafe in Flesqueurs, and in front of the cafe there were some soldiers who buried a tank, Martha Ballou recollected. After further exhaustive investigations, an aerial photograph taken in 1948 showed a mysterious square in a field where no grass grew. Having obtained the necessary approvals, an excavator moved on to the site on the 5th of November 1998, and within 3 hours it had struck metal. On the 20th of November 1998, 81 years after the battle, the rusting hulk of a female tank was exposed. The confirmation that the rusting hulk was Deborah only came to light after a civilian defence contractor called Will Heap confirmed that he was attending the annual Cambrai Day dinner at the Tank Museum in Bovington, Dorset, as was Philippe Gorzinski. Will had a photograph from his grandfather's archive, namely Frank Heap, which matched the damage on the tank excavated in the area west of Flesqueurs. It was the proof needed to confirm that the excavated female tank was indeed Deborah D51. In 2000, the 118th Recovery Company of the British Army moved Deborah to her first new home in over 80 years, a farm barn located in the centre of Flesqueurs, a museum run by Philippe Gorzinski. We were very fortunate that we were granted an audience of Deborah because it's not open to the public. On entering the barn, she is almost ghostly in appearance, with the effect of shelling having ripped out her heart and the resulting death of 5 of her crew. Poppy wreaths at the bottom of the plinth have been laid out next to Deborah since her excavation in 1988. Our World War I trip in October 2016 included visiting Deborah's first home. This year we undertook a 3-day visit to various battlefields and Wargrave Commission sites in and around Flanders. In 2009, the descendants of Deborah's crew met for the first time. The amount of research which must have been undertaken to get family members of the crew together reflects the feeling of connection with Deborah and all her crew. The memorial at Flesqueurs was built by the local residents in the village. the various flags of nations which took place during the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917. The intriguing one for me is the Indian flag. We didn't know that at the time when we went to Flascaz, but the Indian Army was very much involved in support logistics for the British Army. Deborah II, second home, is now a permanent display for this female tank at Cambrai Museum. When you see her, that is very evocative. Talbot House is located in Poperinghe, only 8 kilometres from D51's tankerdrome and workshop area in Ustenhoek Wood. Talbot House is a refuge for all service personnel, irrespective of rank. It was established by Neville Talbot and Philip Tubby Clayton. You didn't need to be a colonel to go to Talbot House. You could be a private. That's what it was there for. The garden at Talbot House. It extends quite far back. It must have been such a beautiful place to get a bit of relaxation after having come off the battlefield a couple of days before. It is now a museum, and if you're ever in that area, please visit it because it is absolutely fascinating. The Battle of Cambrai officially ended on December 7th. The Allies had gained in some areas and lost in others. Overall, the Allies had gained little territory from the battle. British casualties numbered more than 40,000, including 5 of the crew of Deborah D51. German casualties were estimated to be about 45,000. I think the considered opinion of the Battle of Cambrai was a draw. No one side had an outright victory. Acknowledgements for this are Deborah and the War of the Tanks, 1917 by John A. Taylor, Philippe Gorzinski, discoverer of D51, and Andrew Hastie for his help in preparing this presentation. Thank you.
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.